Let's take a closer look at the actual math of your grocery trip, starting with the bottom tier of our list. To keep things perfectly objective, every single brand featured today is going straight through a standardized report card. We are looking at three hard metrics: the actual price you pay per kilogram on the shelves of Coles, Woolworths, and Aldi, the reality of the ingredient list versus the marketing claims, and the single biggest reason you should probably leave it on the shelf. We kick off the countdown with the warm-up offenders. These are numbers 10, 9, and 8. At number 10, we have a household staple that relies entirely on nostalgia to mask a heavily altered product. When you pull up the unit pricing at a major supermarket like Woolworths, a standard block from this brand sits around 444 pounds per $20 and 44 to 100 grams, which scales out to a steep 44 parts per kilogram. But if you think you're paying for premium cocoa, the label tells a different story. The front of the packet highlights rich, creamy textures, but the back reveals cocoa solids make up barely 25 to 27% of the product. The rest? Sugar, milk solids, and vegetable fats used as fillers. This brings us to the core issue: aggressive packaging manipulation. If you feel like the block finishes faster than it used to, you aren't imagining things. Consumer advocacy groups like Choice Australia have tracked massive size reductions across this brand's lineup, with standard blocks quietly dropping from 188 grams down to 170 grams, and individual bars shrinking from 50 grams to 45 grams. By keeping the packaging profile virtually identical while scooping out the physical product, corporate parent companies successfully protect their profit margins at the direct expense of your wallet. Moving to number 9. We see exactly what happens when a brand prioritizes massive box presentation over actual substance. Step into Coles and you'll find their gift boxes retailing for roughly 70 cents per 100 grams. That translates to an astronomical $75 per kilogram. The marketing relies heavily on the illusion of generosity perfect for birthdays or holidays. However, flip the box over. A massive portion of the physical volume you're buying is nothing but molded plastic trays, double-wrapped foil, and literal air. When you look past the cardboard facade to the ingredient list, the primary component is refined sugar, followed quickly by cheap palm oil to mimic the melt-in-the-mouth feel of high-grade cocoa butter. Because this brand is owned by a massive global food conglomerate, the entire production model is optimized for global supply chains and long shelf lives, rather than ingredient integrity. You're effectively paying a premium for cardboard engineering and corporate logistics. Finally, at number 8, we look at the deceptive nature of store-branded, budget luxury lines, specifically the premium tiers popping up in discount chains like Aldi. At first glance, the value seems unbeatable, often priced around $2 per 100 grams or $20 a kilogram. The glossy packaging features elegant fonts, promises of European craftsmanship, and claims of elevated cocoa content. Yet, the actual consumer experience reveals a classic bait and switch. While the front might boldly proclaim a specific regional style, independent testing and historical tracking by Strauss show these discount luxury lines are highly susceptible to silent downsizing. In recent product cycles, these blocks have dropped from 350 grams down to 300 grams with zero downward movement on price, translating to an instant 33% increase in the cost per 100 grams for the consumer. Furthermore, the European formulation frequently relies heavily on emulsifiers like soy lecithin and polyglycerol polyricinoate, commonly known as PGPR, to artificially bind the ingredients together, creating a waxy texture that falls flat compared to genuine artisan tempering. Those are the mild ones. Numbers 7 through 5 start getting personal because these are the brands people trust the most. For a deeper dive into how grocery giants use these exact packaging tactics to quietly raise prices across the confectionery aisle, check out this detailed breakdown by SBS News, tracking consumer trends and shrinkflation, which highlights exactly how these shifting package sizes impact your weekly budget. When you step into an Australian supermarket aisle, the chocolate shelf looks like an endless sea of choices. Dozens of brands, vibrant wrappers, and logos promising ethically sourced cocoa. But if you start flipping those blocks over and looking past the marketing, a very different picture emerges. The illusion of variety fades, revealing that a massive chunk of these seemingly independent brands are actually owned by just a handful of global conglomerates. And lately, those conglomerates have been quietly changing what goes inside the wrapper. Take a close look at the ingredients list on a block of mid-tier, household name chocolate today versus a decade ago. You'll notice a distinct shift. Cocoa butter, the natural fat extracted from cocoa beans that gives chocolate its signature melt-in-the-mouth texture, is expensive. To cut costs, several major manufacturers have systematically reduced the percentage of cocoa butter in their recipes, substituting it with cheaper vegetable fats like palm oil or shea butter. Because palm oil melts at a high temperature, it alters the mouthfeel entirely, leaving a slightly waxy film instead of that clean, rich dissolve. In some formulations, the actual cocoa solids have been dialed back to the bare legal minimum, replaced by increased sugar and milk powders to act as heavy fillers. You are quite literally paying the same price, if not more, for less actual chocolate. But the compromise goes far beyond a waxy texture. To ease the conscience of consumers, many of these trusted brands prominently feature environmental and ethical logos on their packaging. The green frog of the Rainforest Alliance or the classic fair trade symbol are meant to reassure us. However, investigative reports and supply chain audits consistently reveal massive gaps between what these labels imply and what actually happens on the ground, particularly in West African nations like Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, where the vast majority of the world's cocoa originates. While a fair trade certification guarantees a minimum price floor to cooperatives, it doesn't guarantee that every single bean in that specific block came from a certified farm. Many companies utilize a system called mass balance. This means certified sustainable cocoa and non-certified cocoa are mixed together during transportation and processing. A company can buy 10% certified cocoa, mix it with 90% conventional cocoa, and still place the certification logo on their packaging, provided the total volume matches up at the end of production. Furthermore, independent NGOs have repeatedly documented that even on some audited, certified farms, systemic issues like deforestation and hazardous child labor persist because the oversight bodies simply lack the resources to monitor millions of small, remote plots of land effectively. This is where the real sense of frustration sets in for the everyday shopper. We tend to assume that paying a premium price for a legacy brand guarantees a high standard of ethics and quality. In reality, these massive corporations often have the most convoluted supply chains, making them far less agile and less accountable than smaller bean-to-bar operations. They rely on the momentum of their reputation, betting that you won't notice the slight change in texture or look too closely at the fine print of their sustainability pledges. If you thought that was disappointing, wait until you see what's hiding behind numbers 4 through 2 brands practically everyone has in their pantry right now. Walk down the confectionery aisle of any Woolworths or Coles, and you are surrounded by walls of familiar packaging. These are the brands that have occupied Australian pantries for generations. They are the standard choices for school lunchboxes, road trips, and late-night cravings. Because these names carry so much nostalgia, we rarely think to look past the logo. But when you track the corporate history of these household staples, a clear pattern emerges. The moment a beloved local or heritage brand is swallowed up by a global conglomerate, the product itself begins to change. Take a look at how global confectionery consolidation has played out over the last few decades. When massive multinationals acquire smaller, established brands, their primary directive is to scale efficiency and maximize profit margins. The traditional recipes that built the brand's reputation are often the first things targeted for cost-cutting. Premium ingredients get swapped for cheaper alternatives. Palm oil frequently replaces cocoa butter, and the overall cocoa percentage drops. This formulation shift ties directly back to what we looked at earlier regarding milk solids and vegetable fats. It is not an isolated incident. It is a systemic strategy. The goal is to see how much of the expensive, authentic ingredients can be stripped away before the consumer notices a change in taste or texture. Despite these changes, the marketing remains firmly rooted in the past. The packaging still boasts about heritage, traditional recipes, or the authentic taste you love, featuring imagery of pristine dairy farms and rolling green hills. In reality, the supply chain behind that wrapper has become entirely industrialized, often relying on massive agricultural networks where sustainability and ethical sourcing take a back seat to sheer volume. This disconnect between corporate behavior and consumer loyalty is something psychologists call cognitive dissonance. When a brand is deeply woven into our childhood memories, our brains naturally resist new information that contradicts that positive image. Studies in consumer behavior show that we tend to filter out negative press about products we love because accepting the truth creates discomfort. We want to believe that chocolate is the same as it always was, so we look the other way, and there is plenty to look away from. Over the years, these major manufacturers have faced significant scrutiny. International journalistic investigations and supply chain audits have repeatedly linked the world's largest chocolate producers to systemic issues in West Africa, specifically Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which supply the vast majority of the world's cocoa. Despite promising decades ago to eradicate child labor from their supply chains, independent reports continue to document widespread labor violations and severe environmental degradation, including illegal deforestation in national parks that make way for cocoa plantations. Closer to home, regulatory bodies have had to step in regarding misleading labelling. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, ACCC, has previously taken action against major food manufacturers for using prominent imagery like Australian flags or local maps that implies a product is locally made or sourced when the primary ingredients were actually imported from overseas processing plants. It is a highly effective way to leverage local pride while maintaining a cheap, globalized supply chain. As we move up the countdown, the scale of these corporate practices only intensifies, leading right to the top of the list. Now, number 1. This isn't just a bad chocolate bar. It's a brand exploiting a loophole most Australians don't even know exists. The biggest issue with the modern chocolate aisle isn't just that the quality has dropped, it's that the rules are designed to hide it from you. When you look at the packaging of Australia's most iconic chocolate brands, you see images of rich cocoa beans, flowing milk, and heritage logos that promise a premium experience. But if you turn the packet over and look at the legal definitions, a very different picture emerges. To understand how we got here, we have to look at the Food Standards Australia-New Zealand Guidelines, specifically Standard 2.5.1. Under the Australian Food Standards Code, for a product to legally be called chocolate, it only needs to contain a minimum of 15% total cocoa solids. To put that into perspective, the European Union enforces a much stricter threshold, requiring a minimum of 35% total cocoa solids for milk chocolate, with at least 3.5% of that being dry, non-fat cocoa solids. Because Australia's regulatory floor is set so low, major manufacturers have spent years quietly adjusting their recipes to hit that bare minimum. They swap out expensive cocoa butter for cheaper vegetable oils, like palm oil or shea butter, and fill the rest of the volume with sugar and bulk emulsifiers. This isn't a secret recipe change. It's a calculated legal maneuver. The product in your hand still legally qualifies as chocolate under local law, but structurally and culinarily, it shares more DNA with a sugary confectionery paste than actual traditional chocolate. This specific brand represents the absolute convergence of every flaw we've broken down today. Over the last decade, their prices have steadily climbed, while the physical size of the blocks has shrunk, a classic case of shrinkflation. Concurrently, their ingredient list has evolved into a chemistry project, systematically replacing dairy fats and high-quality cocoa with mass-produced substitutes. When you trace the ownership back, you find a massive multinational conglomerate more concerned with quarterly margins and supply chain efficiency than the art of confectionery. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, or ACCC, has historically targeted misleading country of origin claims and deceptive packaging across the food sector, but their hands are largely tied when a company plays strictly within the loose boundaries of the Food Standards Code. If the law says 15% is enough, then legally, the consumer isn't being defrauded even if they feel cheated by the taste. This isn't an isolated failure of a single brand, it is an industry-wide blueprint. When one major player successfully lowers the bar without facing a massive consumer boycott, their competitors are virtually forced to follow suit to maintain their profit margins on the supermarket shelves. The systemic loophole turns a race to the bottom into standard operating procedure. So if these brands are the ones to avoid, what should you actually be buying? Let's fix that. If your pantry is full of the brands we just covered, it can feel like a complete betrayal of your grocery budget and your ethics. Hearing how the chocolate industry operates makes it easy to think the whole confectionery aisle is a write-off. But leaving you with nothing but a sense of frustration isn't the goal here. The expose part of our list is officially behind us, and we are completely shifting gears. We are moving away from the problems and pivoting straight into the solutions. The strategy going forward stays exactly the same. We are keeping the strict evaluation criteria we used for the bad options, analyzing the actual price per kilogram, digging into the ingredient reality, and verifying the supply chain ethics. Only this time, we are looking for the brands that actually pass the test. Finding a genuine alternative requires looking past the standard corporate buzzwords. Independent ethical consumer guides like Good on You and Ethical Consumer evaluate food brands on a systematic level. They look for total transparency in where the cocoa beans are grown, legally binding commitments to paying fair wages, and recipes that don't rely on cheap fillers like palm oil or excessive emulsifiers to mimic real quality. The upcoming brands prove you do not have to sacrifice taste, ethics, or your wallet just to enjoy a block of chocolate. You might even find a few options hiding on standard supermarket shelves that you completely overlooked. Let's start with number 5 on the list of brands actually worth your money. When you look at the landscape of supermarket chocolate, it's easy to feel like the entire industry is a compromise. But changing how you buy doesn't mean tracking down a specialized boutique or spending an absolute fortune. There are choices right on the standard supermarket shelves that treat both the ingredients and the supply chain with a completely different level of respect. Let's look at the first option in this tier. This brand relies on an old-school approach to manufacturing, meaning they don't lean heavily on the vegetable fats or excessive sugar fillers used by the mainstream conglomerates. Instead, the recipe focuses on a noticeably higher percentage of actual cocoa solids, and the texture comes entirely from pure cocoa butter. When you break down the cost per kilogram, you will notice a premium eat generally runs about 20 to 30% higher than the standard mass market blocks. However, because they avoid mass balance mixing and instead source from specific tracked cooperatives, that extra couple of dollars goes toward a completely traceable supply chain. Independent audits by third-party agricultural groups consistently verify that these supply chains operate with much stricter oversight on labor and land clearing than the standard industry baseline. Moving to the next name on our list, this brand stands out because it completely bypasses the standard, self-reported corporate pledges that many multinational companies use to police themselves. Instead, they submit their entire operation to rigorous, independent third-party certification bodies that require physical segregation of the beans. That means the sustainable cocoa they buy is kept entirely separate from conventional cocoa from the moment it's harvested all the way to the final production line in the factory. There is no mixing, no mass balance loopholes, and no statistical guesswork. You can find these blocks sitting directly next to the generic options in almost every major Australian grocery aisle. It proves that ethical sourcing isn't just a niche strategy for tiny, expensive brands. It can scale up effectively without making the product inaccessible. Then we have a brand that approaches production with an emphasis on regional heritage and minimal processing. When you look at their ingredients list, it's remarkably short. They don't use artificial emulsifiers or cheap palm oil variants to chemically alter the melting point of the bar. Industry experts often point to this specific brand as a prime example of how keeping production localized can preserve quality. Because they maintain direct relationships with farming communities, rather than buying blind from massive global commodity brokers, they pay a stable premium directly to the farmers that sits well above the volatile market rate. The result is a clean, distinct flavor profile that doesn't need to be masked by an overload of artificial flavorings or excessive sugar. Those are solid mid-range picks, but the top 2 are the ones I'd actually recommend to anyone. Finding the right alternative usually feels like a compromise. You expect to either drain your wallet on a tiny block of hyper-premium artisanal chocolate, or settle for something that treats its workers and its ingredients as an afterthought. But the top 2 options on this list prove that you don't actually have to choose between a clean conscience and a great piece of chocolate. Coming in at number 2 is a brand that has quietly become the gold standard for mainstream ethical sourcing. Tony's Chocolonely. If you look at the packaging, you'll notice it's deliberately divided into unequal pieces instead of a traditional, uniform grid. That isn't just a design gimmick, it's a physical reminder of the profits in the global cocoa trade, which are notoriously unequal. What sets this brand apart is its transparency. They track their entire supply chain back to the source using blockchain technology, ensuring their beans are entirely free of illegal child labor. They pay farmers a premium that exceeds both the market price and fair trade standards, allowing growers to actually achieve a living income. The main trade-off here is availability. While you can find them in major supermarkets like Woolworths and Coles now, they aren't always stocked at every local petrol station or corner store. At roughly $50 to $60 per kilogram, depending on sales, they sit firmly in the premium price bracket. But for a bar that completely avoids the systemic issues plaguing the giant conglomerates, it's a benchmark for what the industry could look like. That brings us to the number one recommendation, which pulls off a feat most experts thought was impossible, balancing ethical sourcing, high-quality ingredients, and a genuinely budget-friendly price point. That spot belongs to Whittaker's. Based out of New Zealand but widely available across Australia, this family-owned operation manages their entire process from bean to bar in a single facility. They source 100% Rainforest Alliance certified Ghanaian cocoa beans, meaning every step of their supply chain meets strict environmental and social criteria. They refuse to substitute cocoa butter for cheap vegetable oils or palm oil, meaning their milk chocolate actually tastes like chocolate, relying on high cocoa percentages and authentic ingredients. When you break down the math, the value becomes obvious. While the worst offenders on our list hide their rising costs by shrinking their packages down to 160 or 170 grams, a standard block of Whittaker's remains a hefty 250 grams. If you calculate the direct price per kilogram comparison against the major supermarket brands, Whittaker's often comes out to roughly $24 to $28 per kilogram. When you consider that some of the highly processed shrunk-down commercial bars end up costing upwards of $30 to $35 per kilogram when adjusted for weight, you are actually paying less per gram for a vastly superior, ethically produced product. It completely shatters the myth that you have to pay a massive premium just to avoid corporate corner cutting. Now, even if you forget every brand name in this video, this next part is the one thing I want you to remember. Instead of trying to memorize a list of every company cutting corners, you only need to know how to read the back of a single packet. Brands change their recipes and conglomerates buy at local labels all the time, but the labeling laws stay consistent. If you know what to look for, you can accurately judge the quality of any chocolate bar on a supermarket shelf in about 30 seconds. The easiest place to start is the ingredient list, which legally must be ordered by weight, from highest to lowest. In mass market chocolate, the very first ingredient is almost always sugar. While that is standard for milk chocolate, you want to look at how quickly the actual cocoa components appear. If cocoa mass or cocoa butter is pushed down past milk solids and vegetable fats, you are looking at a bar that uses sugar and fillers as its foundation rather than real chocolate. Next, look for the percentage statement. Premium manufacturers will explicitly state the total cocoa solids on the front or back of the pack, usually aiming for 30% or higher for milk chocolate, and 50% to 70% or more for dark chocolate. If a brand completely omits the cocoa percentage, it is often a sign that they are sitting right on that legal bare minimum of 15% and would prefer you didn't notice. The biggest red flag to watch out for is the presence of alternative fats. True chocolate relies entirely on cocoa butter to give it that signature melt-in-the-mouth texture, which triggers at human body temperature. Look closely at the emulsifiers and fat section. If you see ingredients like palm oil, shea oil, fractionated vegetable fat, or hydrojadiate oils, the manufacturer has stripped out the expensive cocoa butter and replaced it with a cheap substitute. These alternative fats don't melt the same way, often leaving a waxy coating on the roof of your mouth. Checking these three elements, the order of ingredients, the declared cocoa percentage, and the absence of vegetable oils takes less than half a minute. It immediately reveals whether a brand is investing in flavor or optimizing for a balance sheet. Now let's put all of this together, because the pattern across every brand on this list says something bigger about the industry. When you look at all 15 brands together, a very clear pattern emerges. This isn't a list of isolated failures or random corporate decisions. The underlying trend connecting every single one of the brands we've discussed is a direct response to a massive shift in the global cocoa market. For the last couple of years, the price of raw cocoa has experienced unprecedented volatility, peaking at historic highs of over $11,000 per tonne before seeing sharp financial corrections. The industry's collective reaction to this economic pressure tells you everything you need to know about who they prioritize. The 10 brands on the avoid list all responded with variations of the exact same strategy. protecting corporate margins by diluting the consumer experience. They quietly shrank the physical size of their blocks, raised shelf prices at Coles and Woolworths, and began systematically reformulating their recipes. To keep production lines running without paying for premium raw materials, they scaled back on actual cocoa grindings and increased their reliance on cheap fillers, vegetable fats, and chemical emulsifiers like PGPR. They effectively gambled that you wouldn't flick the package over to read the ingredient list, or notice that your favorite blocks suddenly felt waxy and hollow. On the flip side, the 5 recommended brands proves that a different business model is entirely possible. Instead of treating cocoa as a cheap commodity to be stripped out during a market squeeze, these companies absorbed the structural shifts in the industry by building transparent, traceable supply chains. They commit to higher baseline cocoa percentages, work directly with farming cooperatives to pay sustainable farm gate prices, and refuse to substitute real cocoa butter with palm oil. The ultimate takeaway is that your purchasing power is the only thing that forces these manufacturers to pivot. Every time we choose a block based strictly on the lowest sticker price, without looking at the cost per kilogram or the percentage of solid cocoa, we reward the exact corporate tactics that are actively ruining the confectionery aisle. So knowing all of that, here's what I'd actually do the next time you're standing in the chocolate aisle. When you look at the entire landscape of the chocolate industry, it becomes clear that the real issue isn't just a handful of bad actors or a single disappointing brand. The challenge we face as shoppers is much broader. The traditional signals we use to judge what we're buying have completely broken down. A higher price tag no longer guarantees premium ingredients, and a beautiful rustic wrapper covered in green leaves doesn't mean the supply chain is clean. The old rules of thumb simply do not work anymore. Because ownership structures shift behind the scenes and recipes are constantly tweaked to manage corporate profit margins, memorizing a static list of good and bad brands won't serve you for very long. A company that makes a fantastic ethically sourced block today could be bought out by a massive conglomerate tomorrow. Instead, the most valuable tool you can take away from this is a simple, repeatable habit every time you walk down the confectionery aisle. Look past the front packaging and read the back label. Check the order of ingredients. Look for the presence of cheap vegetable fats or palm oil replacing actual cocoa butter. Look for explicit mentions of single origin beans or independent, physically segregated supply chain certifications rather than vague corporate sustainability pledges. It is easy to look at the dark side of the chocolate industry and feel entirely defeated. But changing how you look at a label changes the dynamic completely. You aren't helpless in this system. We started by breaking down 10 of the most popular brands on the market to see where they cut corners. Move through 5 genuinely excellent alternatives that deserve a spot in your pantry, and landed on the one skill required to audit any block of chocolate on Earth. Every single dollar you spend at the grocery store acts as a direct vote. When we collectively walk past the waxier, heavily padded formulas and choose to support the companies doing the hard work of tracing their cocoa and paying farmers fairly, it forces the entire market to respond. Drop a comment below and let me know which brand's formulation or sourcing strategy surprised you the most. If you want to keep dissecting the everyday products hiding in your pantry and learn what's actually going on behind the scenes of major household names, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next breakdown.